Good morning and welcome to this edition of the Diversity Advisory Council's Diversity Speaker Series. I'm Alex Lukowski, Executive Director of Media Relations. Our speaker today is leadership coach, belonging strategist, author, and educator Montrece McNeill Ransom. She's currently a faculty member with California State University East Bay in the Department of Public Health and with Walden University School of Health Sciences. She's also director of the National Coordinating Center for Public Health Training within the National Network of Public Health Institutes. Ms. McNeill Ransom received her JD from the University of Alabama School of Law. She has certificates in executive leadership coaching from Georgetown University and diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace from the University of South Florida Mumma College of Business. And she's received numerous awards, such as the Jennifer Robbins Award for the practice of public health law from the American Public Health Association and the Champion for Diversity and Inclusion Award from the American Bar Association's Health Law section. Ms. McNeill Ransom began her career in public health as a presidential management fellow with the CDC and served in the CDC's public health law program for 20 years. She spent the last 10 years of her tenure at CDC as the team lead for public health law training and workforce development. In a few moments, we'll hear her presentation entitled Dying to Belong, Racism, Public Health, and the Law. But first, I want to remind everyone that this program is being recorded, and following the presentation, we'll have 15 or 20 minutes available for Q&A. So please write your questions in the chat area whenever you like, and we'll try to bring you into the conversation. Now, please welcome UMB President Dr. Bruce Jarrell.
Good morning to everyone, and it's my pleasure to welcome Ms. Montrece McNeill Ransom to the University of Maryland, Baltimore this morning. I want to start by thanking the Diversity Advisory Council for putting together this wonderful event. And I'm happy to add that it's sponsored by all 7 of our schools, as well as our Office of Student Affairs. I find that commitment of all of the schools to be very important. I also want to thank all of you who are logged in with us this morning, knowing that this is early for most of you, but hopefully you have gotten your first cup of coffee. I know you've heard me say this before, but I want to keep repeating it. One of the major goals I have is for UMB to be a place where everyone feels that they belong, feels that they're important at UMB, that their voice matters, that their career matters, and that they're nurtured in this environment to succeed and advance their career, regardless of what their role is here. The work of advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion at UMB is ongoing, and it is certainly a collaborative effort that will require a lot of intention, a lot of leadership and focus of all of us, by the way, not just those in senior leadership. I'm certainly pleased to welcome Ms. McNeill Ransom to deepen our knowledge, particularly to this area, the area of belonging and the interrelationships between racism, public health, and the law. And as we know, if we can develop a stronger sense of belonging in our community will become a more whole place, a better place to live and work. And that's part of our major strategic plan. UMB is committed to creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive university and ensuring that everyone here belongs. I am pleased to announce that we've recently hired our inaugural Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, as well as Vice President, Dr. Diane Forbes-Berthoud, who will be leading this charge. But she will only lead in collaboration with each of you if she's going to be successful. So all of you need to put your shoulder to this wheel as well. It's not a one-person show. And Dr. Forbes-Berthoud will also lead our strategic planning, implementation, and accountability in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I hope that we accomplish many of the goals that we've set forth in our strategic plan. Our new strategic plan also identifies university culture, equity, and belonging as important themes to advance in every unit across our campus. So our work will continue on that. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I'm looking forward to what we hear from Ms. McNeill Ransom, and I'm looking forward to not only hearing, but applying that knowledge for us to improve UMB. So thank you for being with us here this morning, Ms. McNeill Ransom. Take it over. It's all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I am super excited to be here to talk about the topic of belonging. I remember so clearly being woken up on a Friday morning. We were living in a tiny trailer, in a tiny trailer park, in a tiny town right outside of Fort Polk, Louisiana. Now, I was confused because it was a school day. But rather than rush me through breakfast and out the door, my mother sat me down between her legs and she began to do my hair. Now, it's important to note, typically she would do my hair on a Sunday evening, and that hairstyle was meant to last all week long. Some of you guys may be able to relate to that. And typically she'd be chatty. How was your week? What are you learning? What's 2 times 58? But on this particular day, she was noticeably quiet. Her hands, this perfect shade of chestnut brown, parted my hair straight down the middle. I could feel her hands slightly trembling as she did so. And then she brought me my Sunday dress, like the Sundiest of all Sunday dresses, lacy and pink. And again, I was super confused because this was a Friday. But that was the day that we married Lewis Mack McNeill. When I tell this story, I always say we got married. I talk about it as our wedding because they always made me feel like we were a team of 3, like we belonged to each other. Our ceremony was beautiful. Just the 3 of us in a tiny brown church. We stood at that front of the church and we took our vows. You know the vows: for better or for worse, richer or for poorer. And we walked out of the church hand in hand. As we drove home in my mom's 1976 silver Pinto pony, I remember sitting in the back seat, buckling and unbuckling my black patent leather Mary Janes, thinking about what just happened. The noon daylight shined through the window of the car on my mother, sitting in the passenger seat, glowing as she fiddled with the 8-track player. Her beautiful 70s afro, big dark brown eyes. I leaned my little pigtail head between the seats and I looked to my left at Mac, this 6-foot-tall man, his head literally almost reaching the roof of the car. And I say to him, I can call you Dad now. That was the beginning of my belonging story. Within a year, Mac legally adopted me. About a year later, I got my first school yearbook. And you guys may remember the feeling of getting the yearbook and scrolling through the pages, trying to find your picture and your name, right? Find my picture and my name. It says first name Montrece, last name Williams. I remember a flood of disappointment rushing through me. I took out a Sharpie marker and I crossed it out and I wrote in McNeill. That was the name of the family that I belonged to. I was a McNeill. The yearbook just got it wrong. That was my first lesson in belonging. A sense of belonging is something you must create for yourself. Today, I serve as the director of the National Coordinating Center for Public Health Training. As mentioned, I'm also a professor, I'm a leadership coach, and I'm a DEI certified belonging strategist. And when I say I'm a belonging strategist, people are like, Montrece, what is that? What is a belonging strategist? Well, when I work with my one-on-one clients, my goal is to remind them that anywhere they are called or aspire to be, they belong. And when working with organizations and leaders, my goal is to help them build anti-racist spaces and cultures of belonging in all of our shared spaces. One of the definitions of belonging is to be in the right and suitable place and know it. And I want you to know you belong here. You belong here at this meeting. You belong at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. You belong anywhere you are called or aspire to be. Belonging means you recognize that I bring my unique background, my race, my ancestry, my culture, my ethnicity, my gender identity, my socioeconomic status, my family composition, my abilities, my veteran status, all of who I am comes to the table. It means that you not only recognize what I bring to the table, that you value my differences and lived experiences as the assets that they are. Belonging is a sense of psychological safety and security. It's what brings force and action to all these efforts that we're making in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And belonging truly is a basic human need. Every single one of us, all of us, have an innate need to feel a sense of belonging. How many of you, I guess by using the chat box, how many of you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Well, for those who don't, just to bring us all up to the same page here, Abraham Maslow was a 1940s human psychologist. And he said that our needs as human beings fall into 5 tiers. And he arranged those tiers in a pyramid. And he suggested that only after satisfying one need at one tier can we then move on to the next. And at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is the need for physiological well-being. So the basic need to eat, to drink, to sleep, to get sun exposure, exercise. Once satisfied, we can then move on to fulfilling our need for safety and shelter. Once we have food in our bellies and a safe roof over our heads, we then move on to what Maslow calls the higher order need of belonging. And according to Maslow, the need to belong is so basic to our humanity that we must satisfy that need before we can fully develop our self-esteem and self-confidence. And the development of self-esteem and confidence must occur before we can reach our full potential, or as Maslow calls it, self-actualize. That's how important belonging is. It is the gateway to human potential. So I want to ask you to just take a minute and think about what belonging means to you. What does it feel like when you know you belong, when you know you're in the right and suitable place? Use the chat box and let us know what word comes to mind when you think about belonging. When I ask this question, I usually get answers like, it feels like acceptance, home, being respected, feeling valued. I often get fitting in. Before we go any further, I want to be clear that belonging is not about fitting in. It's been said that to fit in, I have to be like you. I have to assimilate. I have to put on a mask. I have to do the exhausting work of covering instead of doing the work that needs to be done toward the mission or the goal. When I belong, I get to be me. Belonging is definitely about being accepted for who you are authentically, for everything you bring to the table. And fitting in is also about being accepted, but fitting in is conditioned on you being like them. Fitting in requires some level of hiding who you are. I read an op-ed recently written by John Cho. He's a Korean American actor. He was in the Harold and Kumar movie franchise, if you remember that. But in the op-ed, he talked about the slew of hate messages that he and other Asian Americans faced in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. He talked about how growing up, his mother made him and his brother watch hours of television so that they might learn to speak and act like a real American. His mother's hope was that his race, his background, his ancestry wouldn't be an issue for her boys. She hoped that once they became American enough, whatever that means, they would feel that sense of belonging as an American, that sense of psychological safety. John talks about how he felt glimmers of that hope come to fruition when he became a successful actor. And he probably became an actor because of all that TV watching that his mom made him do. He became famous, and he said doors were open, strangers were kinder. He felt accepted. He felt valued. He felt like he belonged. But then COVID-19 happened, and there was an onslaught of hate crimes and comments against Asian Americans. And this raised the question for him: is my belonging conditional? Have my efforts to fit in been in vain? In his words, he said, one moment we're Americans, and the next we're all foreigners who brought the virus here. But Cho knows a sense of belonging is something we must create for ourselves. He closed the article by saying that he claimed the citizenship that his parents wanted for him. He is an American. He spent his lifetime earning it. So he's not going to let anybody tell him he's not really American. He belongs because he knows he belongs. Cho says he's earned it. But the truth is, not all of us have to earn it, right? There is this implicit privilege that comes with belonging to certain groups, particularly in the United States. For some, there's an embedded sense of mattering, of belonging, that this in and of itself, this way of thinking in and of itself is privilege and not an unconditional expectation for all people, surprises many of my friends who are not people of color. And yes, all of us, no matter our race, ancestry, background, all of us can each think of a moment in our lives where we felt like we didn't belong. It's not a feeling that we easily forget. It embeds in us. But for some of us, that feeling plays out every single day. When it comes to belonging, privilege is not about the presence of a thing. It's about an absence. It's about an absence of attention. When you encounter a law enforcement officer, it's the absence of worry that your motives for being somewhere, just about anywhere, will be questioned rather than accepted without scrutiny. It's the absence of being seen as a threat simply by being. It's the absence of the need to code switch, to put on a mask to fit in. It's the absence of the default feeling of otherness, of being less than, not enough, that many of us in marginalized communities often feel. When I talk about belonging, it's important for me to talk about my belonging story in the field of public health. 20 years ago, when I graduated from law school, it never occurred to me that I'd find a sense of belonging in the field of public health, in a field full of scientists and a scientific evidence base, right? I often tell people that my passion for public health came by way of doing and good old-fashioned human connection. Human connection is at the core of belonging. When I was appointed as a presidential management fellow at CDC 20 years ago, I was also offered positions at the Securities and Exchange Commission, Department of Education, Department of Housing and Urban Development. And the only reason I chose CDC is because my parents had retired from the military. They served almost 20 years each, almost 25 years each in the Army. They retired in Augusta, Georgia, Fort Gordon, which is about 2 hours outside of Atlanta, where CDC is headquartered. I thought it would be good to be close to them, but not too close, right? I couldn't even spell public health when I joined the agency and the public health profession. But my career began in the era of 9/11. I remember heading to CDC's offices and receiving an alert on my BlackBerry. It's like a pager at the time, that our offices were closed for the day because a plane crashed into the Twin Towers. And I'd been at CDC for about 3 months, fresh out of law school. And I had no idea why we'd be closed because of a plane crash in New York when our offices were in Atlanta. But that was the beginning of my belonging story in public health. It was the point where I felt the irresistible pull of public health, that calling. I was asked to work in the Emergency Operations Center at CDC as an operations analyst, a job that did not require a law degree. I was literally playing a game of telephone. I was taking messages from states that had had anthrax attacks and filtering those messages and then passing them along to EOS, the Emergency Operations Center leadership. But it was through that experience that I learned a lesson that would shape the rest of my career. And that there is no public health in this country without the law. From the creation of a health department, which is done by statute, to the passing of a clean indoor air ordinance, it is scientific insight coupled with legal might that creates the frameworks for healthy choices to be the norm. And for me, what was supposed to be a 2-year fellowship turned into a 2-decade career. And honestly, I feel like I'm just getting started, just reaching that point of my full potential. That's what a sense of belonging can do. I'm still often the only person of color in the room, sometimes the only woman. I'm often the only lawyer in a room full of scientists. But I know I belong because I have fought for a sense of belonging. And a sense of belonging is something that we must create for ourselves. If I would have waited for the environment to give me that sense of belonging, I wouldn't be at the point in my career that I am. And a sense of belonging is what unleashes human potential. It's tied to dignity and the ability to live and do good work without shame. So much of what's been happening in our country in the last 18 to 24 months has served to embed in the soul of many people of color that we don't belong. That we don't belong in the gym, at the park, the highway, in our workplaces, in our own homes, or in this country. Events like the murders of Breonna Taylor, Manuel Ellis, James Spurlock, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Rashard Brooks, and so many more whose names must be said. These murders triggered in me and in many in the Black American community this feeling of exhaustion, helplessness, anger, hopelessness. And much of the media and political response to these events wasn't trauma-informed at all. Trauma-informed messaging recognizes that traumatic experiences and their mental and emotional impacts tie closely to behavioral health problems. And much of what I saw in my social media feed and on the news re-traumatized me and others with histories of racism and discrimination related traumas. According to data from the Census Bureau, within a week of George Floyd's death, anxiety and depression among Black Americans shot to rates higher than experienced by any other racial or ethnic group. These mental health statistics, particularly when coupled with the disproportionate burden and illness and death among Black Americans from COVID-19, provided the evidence of what many of us in public health have been saying, what we've known, and what research has continuously shown. Racism, not race. Racism is a public health crisis. The racism and discrimination that people of color experience in our daily lives creates stress that affects our internal organs and overall physical health. This results in a higher prevalence of chronic diseases such as high blood pressure, asthma, and diabetes, as well as shorter lifespans. As Will Jawando, Montgomery County, Maryland council member said, whether it's police-involved killings or disparate health outcomes where Black American patients can't get treatment because they're not seen as being sick, or financial redlining in certain zip codes, food deserts, or people of color getting hit by cars more often because their communities aren't walkable. It's all ultimately due to racism. Impacting infectious disease, this racism that exists in our systems has led to inequities associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Simply being a Black American in this country is a significant social determinant of our health. It's been said being Black is bad for your health, but it's not our race. Pervasive racism is the cause. Want proof? They say knowledge is power, so let me drop some knowledge. Did you know that Black women are up to 4 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related complications than white women? Black men are more than twice as likely to be killed by police as white men. The average life expectancy of Black Americans is somewhere between 4 and 10 years less than white people, depending on where you cite that statistic. A baby born to a Black American mother is 3 times more likely to die before his or her first birthday than a baby born to a white mom. 7% of white people are uninsured in this country. while in Black Americans, the uninsured rate is 30%. For people like me who have dedicated their education and careers to potentially high paying careers, to try to even this socioeconomic class situation, even after class and poverty are accounted for, Black Americans still have worse health outcomes than white Americans. Studies show that the health equity gap is even wider between wealthy white Americans and wealthy Black Americans and their wealthy white counterparts. In fact, when you consider most public health issues and conditions, you'll find striking disparities based on race. I could go on and on. And these disparities are not the result, as one senator has suggested, of poor hygiene or lack of adherence to medical or healthcare guidance. These disparities are the result of deep-seated systemic racism that exists across all segments of our society, from our courthouses to our hospitals, to our schools, to our workplaces. Yes, high rates of poverty, unemployment, poor housing, toxic environmental exposure, as well as less access to quality medical care also contribute to health disparities, absolutely. But there's a growing recognition that racism is a public health crisis. And this growing recognition has led hundreds of jurisdictions, cities, counties, and states to make a declaration that racism is a public health crisis. Now, these declarations are meant to catalyze change across all sectors of government and really to bring an impact across all of what we call the social determinants of health. So criminal justice, education, healthcare, housing, transportation, budgets and appropriations, taxes, economic development, social services, to bring equity all toward the goal of shrinking the health gap between Black Americans, people of color, and the rest of the population. This is a policy approach. A declaration is a policy approach. And it underscores the fact that the law itself is also a critical driver of our health. Law is a social determinant of health. Laws and regulations, how they're enforced, who they're enforced against, and the structural frameworks they create have a profound effect on population level health. And the racism and bias that's built into our system of laws, structures, and institutions has resulted in a system that limits the access that Black and Brown Americans have to the services and conditions required to be healthy. So these declarations are important. But even as these declarations occur, it's going to take more than words on paper to see real change. We already have some really good words on paper that say discrimination in many ways is illegal. So while naming the problem is a good first start, without financial resources, mandates, or a prescription for action, there are many of us who are not convinced that these efforts will result in the meaningful, comprehensive, systemic change that's needed. It's important to recognize that our healthcare system, our legal system, our educational system is staffed by human beings. Individuals who are subject to much of the same programming and social constructs as the rest of us. Racism, bias, and discrimination are as much a part of healthcare, public health, lawyers, judges, educators, as they are a part of the general population. But when you're in a position of authority, particularly in healthcare and public health, you have the power to exert influence on another individual's experiences and outcomes. Your bias, whether it's known or unknown, necessarily impacts individual health and well-being, that individual's health and well-being, in ways that can be profound and long-lasting, that can be generational. Consider this. In 2003, the Institute of Medicine produced a report called Unequal Treatment: Confronting Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Healthcare. And that report noted that while Black people represented 13% of the US population at that time, only 3.3% of US physicians were Black. Nearly 2 decades later, we haven't come that far. Today, only 6% of physicians are Black, and There's a study that recently said that there are fewer Black men enrolled in medical school today than there were in the 1970s. While Black people still represent 13% of the US population. Now, I recognize that racial concordance, one for one between patients and clinicians, is not the magic pill for health disparities. But there is evidence that it can save lives. A recent study published by the National Academy of Sciences found that Black newborns were 3 times more likely to die in the hospital than white newborns when cared by white physicians. We know that clinicians who share similar backgrounds and lived experiences with patients can improve health outcomes. They can improve patients' adherence to medical advice. They can more easily empathize and contextualize, and this improves health outcomes across the board. So representation matters. What I want to bring home here is that racism, bias, and the law are all determinants of our health. And they impact our sense of purpose and belonging. I want you to go with me on a journey to bring this point home. I want you to imagine that you live in an unincorporated community just outside a small city in the Appalachia region. For our purposes, the community you live in is in a small city called Zanesville, Ohio. It's located in the southeastern part of Ohio. It's a tiny, majority Black community located just a few miles outside of the city center. Your community is called Coal Run. It's been named after the road that you live on, most of your community live on. This area is the site of what used to be a robust mining industry, but through the years, that industry has diminished. Your community, Coal Run, sits right on top of a long abandoned coal mine that left behind pollution, which in turn contaminated groundwater. Your home has no running water. You do have a well, but when you try to retrieve water from your well, it looks like, well, maybe it looks like the color of your morning coffee, if you've had your morning coffee yet, with maybe just a little bit of cream. So you and your neighbors have to rely on alternative methods to get safe drinking water, safe water for cooking and bathing. To get by, you collect rainwater and melted snow from your rooftops into buckets and cisterns that quickly become filled with insects and vermin. You save your dishwater and you use it after multiple meals. You buy water from the nearby water treatment plant, spending up to 10 times more than others in your area who have access to public water. You and your neighbors swap war stories. One of your neighbors tells you how, as a child, his parents would fill the bathtub and would not change the bathwater until 5 of the 10 children in the family had bathed to conserve the water. You tell them how even now, today, you only do laundry when it rains, on the days that it rains. Until 2002, the 21st century, you and most of your neighbors still used outhouses. Your community spends 50 years trying to get access to public water. When you approach a county commissioner, he tells you and your neighbors that you won't get water until the president of these United States drops spiral bombs in your community and those bombs hit good water. That same commissioner tells you that your great-grandchildren would be lucky to have running water. So you contact the public health department. And when you do, the staff member who answers the phone tells you, honey, just dig a well. But you know you shouldn't have to dig a well. There are water lines literally flowing throughout the county. Coal Run, your community, is literally surrounded by publicly administered water lines. Now, as you're listening to the story, you're probably thinking to yourself, those poor people, I often get those poor people. And yes, they were poor. But Coal Run, your community, in this case study, was possibly the only majority Black community in the county. In 2002, the county was 94% white and about 4% Black. And the majority of the 4% of the Black County residents lived in, you guessed it, your community Coal Run. So this treatment, this discrimination was definitely based on economics and socioeconomic status. They were poor, but it's also based on race. So you and your neighbors file a complaint with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission asserting a pattern and practice of discrimination that violated federal fair housing laws. The commission, after conducting a lengthy investigation, finds clear evidence that race, the fact that the residents of Coal Run were Black, was a factor in the local government's decision not to give you and your neighbors access to public water. This, my friends, is a true story with at least two overlapping dimensions from where I sit: public health generally, but also health equity. The public health dimension of the Coal Run story draws our attention back to the social determinants of health, the structural, economic, cultural, and political factors that order relationships in this country, the factors that assign social status to members of different populations, that distribute money and power and other resources, and that has the power to build or disrupt communities. In the case of Coal Run, the social determinants were about, one, their standing within the community as Black residents, but also about this complicated infrastructure that allocates water across community lines. And I learned about that in law school and still don't understand that infrastructure. It's complicated. It also brings our attention to the socioeconomic conditions of the community that resulted from the loss of the coal mining industry and the environmental degradation that resulted from all of those years of coal mining. This story should also draw our attention to health equity, this principle that all people should have access to the resources and the social conditions needed to ensure they can maximize their health. In the case of Coal Run, the reason your community had a strong discrimination case was that as compared to their white counterparts, they were unable to get access to a resource that was critical to their survival: water. Because of their race, because they lived in a poor community, because of their location in an unincorporated part of the county, they were subject to inequitable conditions that burdened their pockets, stripped a great deal of time, increased their stress level, and put them at risk. But you know, there's a third dimension to the story, and that's the law. I'm a lawyer, right? And as I've mentioned, law profoundly shapes the context in which we live, learn, work, play, age, and even worship. Law shapes our neighborhoods, shapes our housing stock, shapes our social environment. The law also has the power to distribute resources, to make those things that people need to live healthy lives more accessible. In the Coal Run story, we saw how a legal intervention, filing a discrimination complaint with the Civil Rights Commission, was absolutely necessary for the health of the community. As a lawyer, honestly, those kinds of legal interventions are not always the best approach for communities like Coal Run. They take a long time. They're expensive. They cost a lot of money. And often one-off, narrow, adversarial proceedings, not in the best interests of small communities like Coal Run. But what do we do then? Because sadly, stories like those of Coal Run are not as rare as you'd like to think. And discrimination, bias, and racism not only impact health and health outcomes, but they are obstructive to our feelings of belonging. They lead to disenfranchisement. You know, there's an old African proverb that says that the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. I saw the protests that followed the death of George Floyd as a visual depiction of this proverb in real time. The seemingly continuous killing of unarmed Black people right in the middle of the pandemic served as a painful reminder for many people of color that belonging in this country is often based on conditions often outside of our control, conditions which feel like they're applied at best arbitrarily and at worst, as we saw in the Coal Run story, with the intent to exclude. These events remind us that far too often we don't feel the warmth of the laws and legal protections outlined in our country's founding documents. These events also signal that our lives, our health, and our very existence depends on foundational sustainable change on the individual, community, and systemic level. If we really want to see change in the racial health equity gap in this country, the status quo won't work. Action is needed to reverse hundreds of years of racism and bias that's built into the core of our country. This includes the core of our work in healthcare, in public health, in academia, in education, criminal justice, transportation, the list goes on. We also have to acknowledge that our laws and legal systems and structures are social determinants of health, perhaps the most significant social determinants of health, because they undergird all the other social determinants of health. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, Montrece, I get it. Belonging matters. But what can I do to spark change? What can I do to increase my own individual sense of belonging? What can I do to create a culture of belonging? If a sense of belonging is something that we must create for ourselves, what can I do to spark change? Well, before I turn to offering you some tips on how to do that, I want to pause for a second and answer some questions. If you've got some, I'll just need about 5 to 7 minutes at the end to kind of wrap up my talking point. So my question would be, what questions do we have, if any, so far?
Well, let me bring in Londetta Jones, who, as she points out, always has questions. Londetta, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you so very much for your talk. I am so grateful to have heard you, and I could totally relate to that hair done on Sunday to last you the week. So my question is exactly what you were about to talk about. You mentioned that throughout your career, you're often one of the only race in the room. And so I was curious, what were some of the self-care strategies you used that help you create a sense of belonging and focus on striving to reach your full potential? I think you're about to answer that.
I love that question, Londetta. Londetta?
Yes.
Londetta.
Londetta,
Yes.
I love that question. Yes, so to kind of recap your question for the audience, I have, yes, been, continue to be in many instances, the only woman of color in the room. My 20-year career, I was one of very few public health lawyers of color at the table around conversations related to public health and the law. And for me, it did come down to self-care. One of the things that I like to say is you've got to remember that you first belong to yourself. I teach my clients that if you get to know who you really are, get to know what you're bringing to the table, get to know what you need in the environment that you're in, so that you can recognize when an environment aligns with your values, you can better find your sense of belonging. And I think that this is critically important because, as I mentioned, if I would have waited for an environment to look like me, or for every individual in the environment to understand the importance of the sense of belonging, I wouldn't have reached this point I've reached in my career. So the first tip I say is get to know who you are. Spend time getting to know who you are genuinely. The second thing is find your support system. Find your people. Honestly, as a woman of color at an agency full of scientists for 20 years, my people, my community were often secretaries, women of color who had been at the agency for years, who knew how to maneuver through the political maze of the agency, but hadn't quite made it up in the ranks for whatever reason. But they could help guide me and give me a sense of comfort. And so I would say those are the two key things: get to know yourself so that you know what you're bringing to the table, and find your support system, and recognize that your support system might not always look like you. One of my mentors was a woman who I came to develop a meaningful relationship with, primarily because we bonded over wanting to read books that didn't have anything to do with public health or the law. We bonded over the book called The Devil Wears Prada, and she became a mentor of mine. And this woman was not a woman of color, but she took me under her wing and gave me that support system that really grounded me as a public health lawyer. She's one of the reasons that I continue to do this work. I hope that
Thank
helped
you
answer
so
your
much.
question, Claudette.
Yes, thank you, it did. Thank you.
Alex, you're muted.
You know what? It's someone had to do it, so I thought I would be the one to go ahead and talk when I'm muted. That way, I got it out of the way. Pamela Ruiz is waiting to ask a question. Pamela, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Go ahead. Huh?
So my question is, I work for a healthcare certification and credentialing organization, and I think that we have a real opportunity to impact change, but it's a challenge. And I think you bringing together education and the law and healthcare, they're so intertwined. And I think that our opportunity could very well be in the education piece and the requirements for certification piece. But I also think the heavy lift for us will be the representation and ensuring that there is a real diverse group within our subject matter to help us make that impact. And so I guess my question is, where do we go from here? Because it's hard. It's hard both internally and externally. Internally, making the case for the why and the how, and then the externally to ensure that our subject matter experts feel included and heard, not just at the table, but really included and heard. So, any advice for somebody within an organization, trying to do this?
I love your comments and that question, Pamela. I do want to reiterate that I haven't said this yet. It may come up when I offer some specific tips on how to create cultures of belonging. But if we're breathing, we're biased. It's social programming, right? And so what I would like to see, you mentioned certification and including this language in the competencies. At least that's what I heard. One of my goals is to ensure that in students that are getting masters in public health, that we include ensuring that some sort of individual bias training, implicit bias, competency development is included in. You got to have that before you graduate. I think that that's critically important for medical care, for public health, for lawyers. And so I'm happy to hear you mention that as well for the folks that you work with. Where do we go from here? I think we normalize this conversation. I think that's the first thing we have to do. There is a opportunity we have, particularly in public health and in healthcare, with all these declarations, with the current administration's focus on health equity, and this look at the social determinants of health, which means looking across the board at all the things that impact our health collectively. I think the opportunity comes by way of us using our individual power to come together. I think it takes us doing the work individually to figure out what our implicit biases are, have a conversation, be willing to have conversations about this, normalize these conversations, more meetings like this where we can talk about how bias impacts our sense of belonging in the workplace, how discrimination shows up, even in the most altruistic fields. I tell folks in public health, I know that folks in public health are particularly, and even in the law, people who want to give back. They chose these professions because they want to give back, right? And they love people. And so we don't see bias and racism necessarily show up because we mean for it to. It shows up because it has been embedded in our systems. So we're going to have to do the work inside out to change that. And I also want to just say one quick point on the pipeline and this idea of representation. I just do not believe it is as hard to find people of color to do the work we need done as folks like to tell me that it is. I'm working with a company right now who says they're having a hard time finding engineers of color. There are HBCUs with whole schools of engineering. So I don't understand that. And if you're worried about competency or them being able to perform, there are ways that you can do mentoring programs. There are ways that you can do fellowship programs with folks while they're early in their educational program, so that you can teach them how to do the work. So there are ways. It just takes intention and purpose. And I think we as leaders and organizations have to normalize this conversation and work this language into our strategic plans. It has to be purposely and intentionally included. I hope that helps answer your question, Pamela. I'll offer some more tips at the end.
You know, Montrece, when you talked about the law as a determinant, social determinant of health, I think you struck a nerve here. Let's bring in Kathy Hope, one of our law professors.
Kathy
Who has a lot to talk about that. Do you know Kathy? I guess you do.
Well, hello, friend. How are you?
Wonderful. How are you, Kathy?
I'm better now for having listened to you this morning, of course. Everyone, obviously, Montrece and I know each other well.
We go way
She's amazing. When I saw that she was an invited guest, I just was very excited, and I've tweeted about it nonstop. Yeah, I'm going to bring it back to the law, right? Maryland legislature, starting in 2021, required the inclusion of a racial equity note on lots of legislation. So not every piece, but just like the fiscal and policy note that typically accompanies. So I like your wow. So that's a good wow, right? Have you seen this elsewhere? I'm curious to know how it's working elsewhere, or hey, let's be part of the team that looks at how this is going to work in Maryland.
So I've not seen this elsewhere. I am very intrigued. Definitely, I mean, this is Kathy knows part of what we do as public health lawyers is study the impact of law and policy on health and health outcomes. And so my curiosity is what toward what end? So if we put the health equity note in there, I think that's definitely a good start. But then what do we do with that? Do we analyze it then? And then
so it's a racial equity note,
okay.
And it is designed to actually, I think, prevent unintended consequences that would further embed racial inequities, right? So if you see it, if in analyzing the bill, they see it, now we're aware, and we might make modifications to the bill. Or if we think we have a bill that is going to eat away at racial inequities, but the analysis proves otherwise, we again don't go forward with that bill or make changes to that bill to try to make improvements. So that's how I've seen it, as either a speed bump to a bad bill, or a notice of us of how to fix what is intended to be a good bill, so it really has the impact of reducing racial inequities.
So yeah, I would love to see if other states are doing this. This is my first time hearing of this. This is a part of normalizing the conversation.
Yep. I'll send you some stuff about it, and we can talk offline.
Yeah, I'm seeing an article, Kathy.
That's what I'm saying. You can write it.
Yeah.
No, I'm teasing.
We can do it collaboratively.
We will do it together.
Yeah, and Kathy, this is Bruce. You didn't point out that the Speaker of the House now is an African American woman, and she's had a wonderful impact already, and I have no doubt that she will continue to have that impact.
Representation matters.
Yes.
Absolutely. Our first woman and our first Black person or person of color in the Speaker of House position. And the Speaker, Adrienne Jones, is absolutely phenomenal.
Awesome.
Thanks, Montrece, for coming today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm honored to be here.
We have an anonymous question. It's about environmental racism. It's something that is not new, of course. It's been talked about for a long time. We don't seem to be able to stay focused on it. This person writes that the GAO first recognized environmental racism in 1983, when a study found that 75% of communities near hazardous dumps were predominantly Black. Much more recently, years later, 2018, the EPA found that looking at air pollution, that the burden was 28% higher for people of color, and Black people specifically had 54% higher burden of the air pollution hazard than the population as a whole. With all the efforts to mitigate climate change, we talk about billions of dollars. Why aren't we talking about environmental racism?
It's a great question. And why isn't environmental racism at the center of this climate change discussion? I think that there are pockets of people, I know some folks who focus on environmental racism. And honestly, the tools that they're using right now are these one-off adversarial proceedings for communities. I think what's missing is a national approach to address environmental racism, environmental justice in a systemic way. EPA, there are executive orders, there's environmental justice focused programs, but it all seems to be narrow and and individually focused and not systemically focused. I don't know what the answer is, other than really focusing on. Actually, I do think I know what the answer is. We need a change in federal law. We need a change in federal law. We need to direct resources, and we need to mandate that we, maybe it's a racial equity note around environmental degradation and justice and cleanup. Maybe there's some way to include some language around where, but we do health impact assessments. They're supposed to help us figure this out. They're supposed to help us determine what the health impact, right? And that's not working. So we need a better national approach. And it probably starts with some sort of federal law that trickles down to the states and then to the locals for sure.
And maybe that should be part of the conversation. Whenever we talk about climate change, we should be talking about
Centered.
the environment. It's a health issue for everyone.
Yes.
Kathleen Palmer is here with a question about education. Kathleen?
Oh, thank you, Ms. Ransom. This is an excellent presentation. I appreciate you coming and speaking to us. This is our university-specific question that I have. I know we've, for the past year, had everyday bias training for healthcare professionals, but it seems to be only offered for the faculty. And I was wondering, and as you said, if you're human, you have bias. I was wondering if there is a plan for having such training for other healthcare professionals and even not healthcare professionals, because it would be super helpful for all of us who want to be better and more aware of our biases. Have I missed it on campus, or is this something that might be planned?
I'm going to let you guys answer that question, Alex and
Sure.
Jarrell. But I do want to say, and the students, are students being offered an opportunity to take this everyday bias course as well? That's my question.
So Kathy, thanks for your question, and I'm not sure I can answer completely. I can tell you for the students, there's a lot of discussion and now implementation of curricular changes that actually get cultural competence in a meaningful way in the curriculum. I want to say to you that there are staff efforts, but I can't quote them precisely. I know the faculty efforts. So you've got a box that I need to check here, but I can't do it right this second unless somebody's on the call who knows more about this than I do. So
that's a really good point. If someone would chime in, we'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, we do have a sort of a somewhat related question from Isabel May, who's asking about what structures and programs can address that sense of belonging that you talked about right at the beginning. Isabel, are you there?
I am. Yes. Hello.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Hey, so Montrece, thank you so much for your wonderful, wonderful talk. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from you for the rest of the presentation. So you were talking, and I was really struck by, your story and the sense of that, creating a sense of belonging starts with the individual, and it resonated with me a lot. And at the same time, I'm wondering that if we need to combat, and I think we desperately need to in this country and the world, combat structural racism, how can we create structures and institutional program structures of some sort that help and support individuals in being able to build that sense of belonging for themselves in communities where they might not be and will not be as represented as they should be or need to be?
Oh, that's almost a little bit of a triggering question for me. Ultimately what comes to mind to me is make space for me to talk about my lived experiences and be open to hearing about them. Affinity groups help when that's a structural tool. Having an affinity group helps. But when you're the only person of color, it's hard to pull together an affinity group of other people of color as a structural tool. And so I really think it part of the structure, it starts with the leadership, creating opportunities for conversations, embedding language around equity, belonging into the mission, and purposely, even if it's including it in a vision statement or a mission statement, but purposely acknowledging that we want to create a culture of belonging. I think that you can, for people like me, having been the only person of color, I would be in a space and want to say something. For example, a state was going to pass a law related to having every child needed to have their teeth cleaned before starting school. And we were offering some commentary on that. And I remember looking around the room thinking, I'm the only mother, I'm a single mother, I am the lowest paid person around this table. And everybody's talking about how this is a great law. But this law, if I were the one having to adhere to it, I'd have to take off of work, make sure I had the right insurance, make sure we'd have transportation. And I would be apprehensive about expressing those opinions until my boss said, we want to hear your lived experiences. We want to hear how this will impact you. So it takes from the leadership purposely saying, this is a space for you to talk about these issues. As far as structures, I think, there are so many ways. I mean, the ultimate goal is if it's not a difference that makes a difference, then we don't need to focus on it. There are gender neutral restrooms are an example of a structure that lead to sense of belonging. The use of pronouns consistently, all of us using pronouns so that it becomes normalized. That's another way. Using the nominal group technique in meetings to ensure that every person's voice is heard is another structural mechanism that can be used to increase a sense of belonging. Allowing for diversified start and end times for meetings or for work days, for parents or for biological clocks are another way to embed a sense of belonging. I think that there are many, many ways. I'll stop there. I hope that helps answer your question.
Going back to what you were saying about support, the question, I'm going to put Greg Brightbill on the spot because he made a very good point. We have an intercultural center. Greg, can you talk about it?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, in support of, by the way, thank you so much for everything you've shared today. Absolutely fantastic. And Dr. Gerald, thanks for joining. So the Intercultural Center, led by Dr. Courtney Jones-Carney, has really placed a lot of emphasis on the need for education that works for faculty, staff, and students as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion, anti-oppression, affinity groups. And I think as we continue to grow in having these conversations, it's really about incorporating not only those conversations amongst faculty on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but having it as a campus community. And so having students talk to staff, talk to faculty, to listen to community, where we are all, in the end, just having a conversation on this. And so I think that's really where I believe it's important. And to answer the question that was put forward earlier, the Intercultural Center does provide anti-bias training for faculty, staff, students, and even community members. Anybody these days who wants to Zoom in can join in the conversation.
All right, that's great. If we have time for one more question, I want to bring in Yolanda Santa Rosa. Yolanda, I've got to scroll down because your name starts with a Y and I was at the other end with Greg. So Yolanda, go ahead if you would. Yolanda? Oh, well, I'm going to ask her a question. I think it's a good question. I want to make sure she got it in. She says, I do think that bias training should be offered to all employees on campus. I'm an HR generalist at the dental school, and there are many times that I have to have a conversation with supervisors about their bias and how it affects their employees. So that may be a good way to get into what you were talking about, steps we can take.
Well, let's do it.
Okay.
So when I first started doing this belonging work, the question is always, what do we do? What can we do to build cultures of belonging? And so I'd like to leave you with a 5-step SPARK model that I created for fostering belonging. And it really is to spark your thinking about actions you can take individually and collectively to foster a sense of belonging in all of your shared spaces. My hope is that this might be helpful as a framework for action. At the heart of the SPARK model is really valuing and affirming and listening to each other, and really finding value in our authentic identity, our uniqueness. So step one of the SPARK model, the S in the SPARK model, is about making space for authenticity. As I mentioned, when we try to fit in rather than show up authentically, we're often hiding or downplaying who we are. And when we do that, we are taking away time that should be spent on the mission. I often find that this idea of making space for authenticity starts with ourselves. If we make space for ourselves to show up authentically, we give permission to other people to do the same. It's important that as leaders, as all of us as leaders, we recognize that true belonging can only happen if you make space for authenticity. So that's where I'd start, make space for authenticity. Step two, focus on being PC, not politically correct, instead being professionally competent. It didn't surprise me that the HR generalist was having to talk to folks about bias, because this is a bottom line human resources issue. Human potential is unleashed when we feel like we belong. The mission is moved forward in a more effective way when we feel like we belong. So being PC means be professionally competent, people-centered, and also personally compassionate. Step three of the SPARK model is about developing an acceptance mindset. This is tied to showing up authentically and making space for others to do the same, and remembering that no one wants to be tolerated, othered, or tokenized. Step four is about representation across races, genders, ages, experiences. You have to purposely include more diversity at the table and in positions of power and decision-making positions. If you don't do it now, I want you to start looking around the room and asking yourself, who is missing? This is one of the best ways to foster a sense of belonging and retain a diverse talent pool, because diversity, equity, and inclusion is about getting them. Belonging is about keeping them. Belonging asks, can you keep them? Step five of the SPARK model is about knowing your own individual biases and being able to recognize when biases are rearing their ugly head. Our biases can be conscious or explicit or subconscious or implicit. We all have them. If you're breathing, you're biased. It's important that we learn what our negative biases are and do the work to overcome them. We need to understand where our knee-jerk reactions come from and do the work to overcome the negative biases that we carry. These steps, the SPARK model, SPARK, is meant to do what the acronym says, to spark change. Spark change. Because when we feel like we belong, you've seen it, you felt it. When we feel like we belong, we feel a responsibility to our families, to the schools we belong to our communities, to our nation. When we feel like we belong, we feel called to come together, just like me, my mom, and my dad, to use our collective power to bring our vision of a better future to life. The reality is, you guys have said it, our interests, our motivation, our health, our happiness are tied to feeling that we belong to a greater community that may share our common interests or aspirations or our mission. If you don't remember anything I've said today, remember this: belonging is the gateway to full self-esteem and true self-actualization. And as a nation, that should be the ideal for each and every one of our citizens, regardless of race. And that's my speech. Thank you.
Well, that was a powerful discussion, and I think your spark will be more than just a way to remember something. I think there will be a spark here about how we do some more of these things a lot better on this campus, because in the end, we got to start at home, and this is home for us. So we'll start here. So I just want to thank you for the time that you put in with us. It was much appreciated. I actually don't know how to say more thank yous than how many times do you say thank you? So thank you for being here. And on behalf of our whole community here, please thank you. Please know that we appreciate what you said and hope to have a follow-up discussion on exactly these topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank
All
you
right.
so much for having me.
Thank you to the audience, and especially for those who had questions.
I want to leave my information here just in case anyone wants to keep in touch.
Got it. And Alex, you can circulate that, please.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day and a great rest of your week.
Okay. See you, Montrece.